Imagine yourself walking through the city on a typical day. You come across a scene that catches your attention. An unemployed and visibly dejected nurse approaches a homeless woman. In an unexpected act of kindness, he invites her to have a coffee. The next day, something extraordinary happens. A limousine appears at his doorstep, completely changing the course of their lives. Julio is a 41-year-old nurse who has worked for 5 years in a major hospital. During this time, he has experienced various situations and heard many patient stories. However, that afternoon, something unexpected was about to happen. Julio came from a humble family and worked hard to become a nurse. While studying nursing at night, he worked during the day in a store. The routine was exhausting, but he never gave up on his dream. With excellent grades, he graduated and got an opportunity at a clinic, where he learned to deal with patients and identify signs of health problems. After some time at the clinic, Julio finally landed an interview at his dream hospital. His performance was excellent, and he was hired. Since then, he has dedicated himself to caring for patients, finding joy in helping people in fragile situations. Julio works in the emergency room, a place where patients arrive in quite complicated conditions. He has treated people with severe injuries and urgent health problems. The experience made Julio believe he had seen it all, but that changed when a woman about 50 years old arrived in the emergency room. It was a typical day, with some patients being treated for minor injuries, when a ragged, dirty, and very confused woman walked into the emergency room. Everyone looked at her. She made sounds that seemed like groans and couldn't speak or think clearly. The woman appeared to be in a state of stupor, as if disoriented. Julio's colleagues began to comment that she was probably homeless, perhaps drunk or under the influence of drugs. The woman had no visible injuries, just very dirty. There was no blood on her clothes or skin. Normally, the emergency room team would send someone in this condition away, following standard procedure. However, Julio noticed something different. The woman did not seem to be altered by alcohol or drugs. He suspected she might be facing a serious health problem and asked his colleagues for patience, requesting to talk to the patient. Barbara, the head nurse, watched the situation. Julio approached the woman and began to speak to her calmly and gently. He asked her name, but she didn't respond. Julio then tried other simple questions, hoping for some kind of answer. Gradually, he realized she was trying to communicate, but something was preventing her. Determined to help, Julio asked to take the woman to an examination room. There, he and the team began asking basic questions and examining her condition. They discovered the woman had a high fever and severe dehydration. She needed urgent medical care. While taking care of the woman, Julio discovered her name was Maria. She was disoriented because of a severe infection affecting her nervous system. Maria had no family or friends to help her and had been living on the streets for a long time. Julio and the team did everything they could to stabilize her condition. Over time, Maria began to improve. She was treated with medications and hydration, and Julio visited her every day, talking to her and offering support. Gradually, Maria began to open up and share her story. She had lost everything and ended up on the streets without hope for a better life. Julio's dedication made all the difference in Maria's recovery. He not only treated her as a patient, but also as a human being in need of compassion and care. The hospital staff was impressed with Maria's improvement and Julio's commitment to helping her. In the end, Maria was transferred to a shelter where she could receive more support and start a new life. Julio continued to visit her whenever he could, ensuring she was well and had what she needed. This experience changed Julio's perspective on his work and the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. Julio learned that behind every patient, there is a story and a struggle. He decided that, as long as he could, he would do everything to be a light in the lives of those who need it most. And so, that afternoon, Julio not only saved a life, but also renewed his own hope and purpose as a nurse. Let me tell you a story about a hospital and two people who worked there, Julio and Barbara. Julio is a nurse well-liked by everyone. He is attentive, always willing to help, and very competent in his work. Doctors and patients think highly of him. Barbara, on the other hand, is also a nurse, but people say she only got the position of chief because she is the niece of the hospital director. The other nurses speak poorly of Barbara behind her back. They believe she does not deserve the position she holds. Julio, however, is different. He respects Barbara and never gets involved in gossip. Despite this, Barbara does not like Julio very much. She hears doctors talking about how efficient and competent he is, and this bothers her. One day, Barbara heard that Julio could be promoted to head of the department, but her uncle used his influence to give the position to her. This made Barbara feel threatened by Julio's presence. Without admitting it, Barbara wanted to find a way to get rid of Julio. She thought that if she could transfer him to another department, the comparisons between her work and his would end. However, this was difficult because Julio was very well liked by everyone. Barbara patiently waited for an opportunity. One day, she saw Julio being helpful to a patient in a renowned hospital. The patient was very agitated and nervous, and Julio was trying to calm her down. He was talking to the woman, whose name was Angelica, and got her to sit in a chair. Julio asked Angelica to take a deep breath and try to calm down. Gradually, she became more relaxed and was about to explain what she was feeling. At that moment, Barbara approached and harshly asked Julio what he thought he was doing. Julio was startled by her approach and jumped slightly in his chair. He explained to Barbara that Angelica was a patient and, although she had no apparent injuries, she was clearly in an emergency and needed help. Julio was just trying to help her. Angelica, who was beginning to calm down, was frightened again when she saw Barbara. Julio tried to make Barbara understand that this woman needed help, but Barbara did not seem willing to budge. She wanted to seize the opportunity to create problems for Julio. While Julio tried to calm Angelica, Barbara continued to question his actions. She did not care about the patient's well-being and was more focused on discrediting Julio. Julio, however, remained calm and continued to explain that Angelica needed immediate care. He asked Barbara to help him care for the patient, but she did not want to cooperate. Finally, a doctor from the department arrived and saw what was happening. He knew Julio and knew that he always acted with professionalism and care. The doctor quickly assessed the situation and realized that Angelica needed urgent care. He asked Barbara to step aside and let Julio continue his work. Barbara left reluctantly, but there was not much she could do. The doctor praised Julio's actions and thanked him for always being attentive to the patient's needs. Julio, with his calmness and dedication, was able to help Angelica, who finally received the necessary care. After this episode, it became even clearer to everyone in the hospital how exemplary a professional Julio was. Even in the face of difficulties and Barbara's attempts at sabotage, he remained focused on patient care. This earned him even more respect and admiration from everyone around him. And so, the story of Julio and Barbara teaches us about the importance of being fair, dedicated, and respecting each other, regardless of the circumstances. Julio showed that with patience and professionalism, it is possible to overcome challenges and continue doing good. Julio was at the hospital when he saw a woman who seemed to be very drunk or even worse. He knew that even though it was a private hospital, they couldn't simply ignore someone who needed help. He told this to Barbara, who was a rather strict boss. Julio explained that the woman had a name and therefore was not homeless. Moreover, the hospital had a duty to handle emergencies and couldn't send her away without help. Barbara was very displeased with what Julio said. She didn't want anyone challenging her authority. So, she told Julio loudly not to turn his back on her and to obey her orders. She wanted him to take Angelica, the patient, out of the hospital immediately. But Julio, with great patience, calmly replied that he wouldn't do that because Angelica needed medical help. Barbara, now more irritated, repeated the order for Julio to send Angelica away. Julio noticed that Angelica was becoming increasingly nervous about the situation. So, he decided to try another approach. He stood up and told Barbara that he would take Angelica out of the hospital and accompany her to the exit. Barbara, thinking she had won, was satisfied. Julio then took Angelica's hand and led her out of the hospital, but not through the main entrance. When they got outside, he asked Angelica to trust him. They walked together to another access door to the hospital. Julio decided to take Angelica to the nurse's break room, where he knew no one would be at that hour. He wanted to better understand what was happening with her. In the break room, Julio sat across from Angelica and noticed she was trembling. From Julio's experience, He knew she was going through trauma. As a healthcare professional, he felt it was his duty to help her. Julio gave Angelica a glass of water and asked her to take deep breaths. She began to cry and seemed to be out of breath. He then asked if she was feeling any physical pain. Angelica pointed to her right arm. Gently, Julio asked if he could examine it more closely. He saw that the arm wasn't broken but had bruises, as if she had been assaulted. Julio knew he needed to report this to the police, but also wanted to better understand the situation. He asked Angelica to try to say something that could help him understand who she was and how he could help her. Gradually, Angelica calmed down and told Julio that she had been away from home and her family for a long time. All she wanted was to see her family again. Julio listened attentively and realized that Angelica needed more than just medical care. She needed support and a friend. Once upon a time, in a hospital, there was a nurse named Julio. He was taking care of a very confused lady who seemed to be under the influence of some substance. Julio wanted to help, so he asked if she knew her son's phone number. But the lady couldn't remember, so he decided that the best thing to do was to help her calm down and detoxify. Julio took the lady, named Angelica, to a hidden corner where no one could see. He laid her on a stretcher and gave her medication that would help cleanse her system and calm her down. Gradually, the tension in Angelica's face began to fade. Julio was sure he was doing the right thing, but he was worried that his boss, Barbara, would see what he was doing. When the medication was almost finished, Barbara showed up. She saw Julio attending to Angelica and was furious because he hadn't followed her orders. Barbara was the head of the department and liked to be in charge of everyone, but she couldn't fire someone without a good reason, especially a nurse as good as Julio. However, she was determined to find a reason to dismiss him. With a satisfied smile on her face, Barbara approached Julio and asked what he thought he was doing. Julio, polite but firm, explained that he was taking care of a patient who needed help. Barbara looked at the medication label and accused Angelica of being a drunk. Julio replied that even if she were under the influence of some substance, he couldn't leave her without care. Barbara was displeased with the response. She said that Julio had received clear instructions not to attend to Angelica and that he had lied by claiming he had taken Angelica away but instead brought her back to the hospital. She also complained that he was using hospital resources to care for a patient who couldn't pay. Julio, trying to stay calm, said that the cost of the medication could be deducted from his salary. He just wanted to help someone in need, but Barbara didn't seem to care about that. She was more concerned with asserting her authority and finding a reason to punish Julio. The situation was tense, but Julio didn't regret his actions. He believed that, as a healthcare professional, his duty was to care for everyone who needed it, regardless of their financial situation. He hoped that, in the end, his commitment to care and compassion would be recognized, even if Barbara was against him. There was a free stretcher in the hospital, and no paying patients were waiting for it. So, there was no issue in using that stretcher to help someone. Barbara, the head nurse, was becoming increasingly irritated, but Julio, one of the nurses, remained calm. She told Julio that his attitude was unacceptable, especially in front of other staff members. Barbara continued to say that Julio was a terrible professional and didn't care about the hospital because he had helped the homeless person. She explained that they would now have to disinfect all the places that person had been. Julio responded that it was the duty of any hospital and any doctor or nurse to provide emergency care, no matter who the person was. Barbara insisted that the homeless woman was just very drunk and shouldn't have been on a stretcher. Annoyed by Julio's response, she said he could no longer work at the hospital. Julio, remaining calm, asked if he was being fired. Without hesitation, Barbara confirmed that he was, as there was no room for an undisciplined nurse like him. Inside, Julio was very sad but knew he had done the right thing. He couldn't leave Angelica, the homeless woman, out on the streets without help. She might have been a victim of someone with bad intentions. Even if she had become intoxicated on her own, she needed help to detox and avoid danger on the streets. Barbara felt great satisfaction in firing Julio. For her, taking someone's job was the biggest demonstration of her authority as head nurse. She didn't think about how this would affect Julio's life and his family. Meanwhile, Angelica was starting to come out of her stupor after receiving medication. Barbara, angry, ordered Julio to leave the hospital and take Angelica with him. She also emphasized that he should not expect to receive any entitlements, as he was fired for disobeying orders. Julio, though saddened, decided to leave without arguing. He knew that Barbara was immature and unprepared to be in charge, but since she was the director's niece, her decision would be respected. Gently, Julio removed the needle from Angelica's arm and asked if she would like to have a coffee with him at the cafe on the corner. Angelica, starting to feel better, accepted the invitation. Julio knew that the caffeine would help with her recovery and that he could gather information to help her find her family. Barbara, impatient, yelled for both of them to leave the hospital. Julio remained calm, ready to help Angelica move forward and find a solution to her situation. Angelica was trying to get up, somewhat awkwardly, when Julio, with all his grace, helped her and guided her to the hospital exit. Barbara, on the other hand, was not at all pleased and decreed that Julio should wait for the security guard Salvador. According to her, both Julio and Angelica needed to be searched before leaving. Who knew what Julio might be hiding in his pockets, or if Angelica had tampered with the medications? Julio, already tired of the situation, asked if this was really necessary. Barbara coldly replied that it was, because, according to her, people like them weren't trustworthy. Julio, unfazed, said he didn't mind going through that additional humiliation. He stated that he had never stolen anything in his life, but made sure to warn Barbara about her behavior. He said that a real nurse would never deny care to a patient or fire a colleague for helping someone. Additionally, no nurse would subject a patient to such a humiliating situation. Barbara, uninterested, shrugged and stated that she didn't care about Julio's opinion. The security guard, Salvador, was called over and, feeling awkward, began the search. As he frisked Julio and Angelica, Salvador apologized quietly. He knew Barbara wasn't a good professional and was only in that position because of her influential uncle. Unfortunately, neither Salvador nor the other employees dared to challenge her for fear of being fired. Surely, Barbara's behavior would serve as a lesson to prevent anyone else from standing up to her. Something curious happened during the search. Salvador looked at Angelica and had the feeling that he had seen her before. But where? The awkwardness of the situation made him give up trying to remember. He couldn't pinpoint when or where he had seen that woman. Maybe she frequented the hospital for some reason. With an apologetic look, Salvador continued to watch Angelica as she left with Julio. He was sure he knew her, but in his memory, she was different. He imagined her well-dressed and coiffed, something difficult to associate with the woman he saw now. Salvador thought he was confusing Angelica with some wealthy patient and ended up laughing at the thought. But, seeing Barbara's serious expression, he stopped laughing immediately. Julio and Angelica went to the cafe on the corner of the hospital. At first, the staff didn't want to let Angelica in because she was very dirty, but Julio, with his always kind demeanor, managed to convince them. They sat down, and Julio ordered coffee for them. Julio waited patiently while Angelica drank half of her coffee. He then asked if there was anyone he could contact. Angelica, with a confused look, said she was looking for her son. Although she didn't know exactly why, every time she thought of her son, the hospital came to her mind. She said her name was Angelica and that her son's name was Artur. She explained that she had wandered the city streets for days. When she saw the hospital, she knew it was the place where she would find Artur, who might help her. Julio asked if Angelica knew anything more about her son besides his name. Maybe he worked at the hospital as a janitor or a clerk. Angelica closed her eyes, trying to remember something concrete, but couldn't. After a while, she said she remembered Artur's phone number. With great effort, she gave the number to Julio. He called, but no one answered. The call went to voicemail. Julio left a message saying his name was Julio and that he was with a lady named Angelica who was looking for her son Artur. He explained that Angelica was physically fine but confused. Not knowing when the message would be heard and responded to, Julio decided to take Angelica to his home. He couldn't leave that woman alone on the streets. If no one answered the call, he would contact the police the next day. With the little money he had in his wallet, Julio paid for a taxi. Normally, he would take the bus home, but he couldn't subject Angelica to a long and uncomfortable journey. She needed a bath, food, and rest. After a few hours of sleep, Angelica might be able to explain better who she was and why she was in that difficult situation. Julio believed that Barbara was wrong in judging Angelica. Maybe her son worked at the hospital or a nearby company. Julio lived with his mother, Augusta. When he got home and told everything, Augusta was very supportive of Angelica. Julio feared his mother's reaction, as he had been the only one working at home for almost a year, and the salary barely covered the bills. Now he had lost his job. Even so, Augusta said he acted correctly. That woman needed help, and it wouldn't be right to leave her on the street, as Barbara wanted. Augusta had always been a big-hearted woman, and Julio knew he could count on her. He believed that, with a bit of luck, they would find Artur or someone who could help Angelica recover her memory and her life. Until then, Julio and his mother would do their best to take care of her. And so, Julio and Angelica spent that night. He knew that the journey to help Angelica was just beginning, but he was determined to do whatever was necessary to help this lost woman find her way back home. Once upon a time, there was a woman named Augusta. She was a hard-working mother who fought all her life to raise her son, Julio. Though life was tough, she never complained. She always did what was necessary to keep the household running. However, over a year ago, Augusta lost her job as a domestic worker for a wealthy family. Due to her age, she couldn't find another job. Every day, she prayed to the Virgin of Guadalupe, asking for a job and for her son to succeed in the career he chose out of love. One day, Augusta prepared dinner for herself, Julio, and a friend named Angelica. They had tacos filled with refried beans. Augusta was an excellent cook, and Angelica was very grateful for the warm welcome and the meal. During dinner, Julio and his mother noticed that, despite being very downcast, Angelica had very polite manners at the table. It made it seem like she came from a well-off family and wasn't just pretending to be someone important. As they talked, the medication Julio had given Angelica seemed to be working. Angelica began to remember being in a place without windows and, suddenly, on a busy street. She didn't know why she was in that dark place, but she remembered feeling very distressed, thinking about her son, Artur, and how her absence would make him suffer. Tears started to roll down Angelica's face. It was clear that something terrible had happened to her. Julio suggested that Angelica take a nap to clear her mind. Augusta helped Angelica take a bath, lent her pajamas, and put her to rest. Angelica fell asleep almost immediately upon laying her head on the pillow. Julio was worried, but after talking with his mother, he felt even more certain that he had acted correctly. Augusta told him she would have been very disappointed if he hadn't helped Angelica. "What kind of person refuses to help someone in need?" she said. Despite their financial difficulties due to Augusta's job loss, they could sleep soundly, knowing they had done the right thing. The next morning, before Angelica woke up, the phone rang. It was the number Julio had called the day before, the one Angelica said was her son's. On the other end was a very nervous man, asking if Julio was really with his mother. Julio confirmed that he was. The man then asked if she was available, or if that was a negotiation contact. Confused, Julio said that Angelica was free and well, and that he had found her very confused in a hospital for reasons that weren't worth mentioning, so he had taken her to his home. Artur, Angelica's son, asked for Julio's address and if he could wait for him to arrive. Saddened, Julio realized he no longer had a job, but he knew he had helped someone in need. And, at that moment, that was the most important thing. When Artur arrived, he thanked Julio and Augusta from the bottom of his heart. "You saved my mother's life," he said, moved. Julio and Augusta smiled, knowing that, despite all the difficulties, they had made a difference in someone's life. And that, they knew, was what really mattered. Julio waited anxiously for Angelica, Artur's mother, to return. Each second felt like an eternity as he awaited news of her. The worry weighed heavily on his chest, not only for Angelica's safety but also for his mother Augusta's situation, who could no longer work as before, especially as a domestic worker. The uncertainty about the family's financial future was an additional burden Julio carried. Finally, the phone rang. It was Artur, informing that he was on his way to meet his mother. Julio felt a mix of relief and renewed worry. He knew that Angelica had woken up about 10 minutes after the call. With the help of the medication, a refreshing bath, and a restorative night's sleep. She seemed like a new person. Less confused and more awake, she was ready to reunite with her son. Upon seeing Angelica wake up, Julio suggested she wash her face and change into something more comfortable. Her clothes from the previous day were stained by the traumatic incident and could not be reused, even after a careful wash. They sat at the kitchen table, where the aroma of beans and eggs filled the air as they shared breakfast. Angelica, although visibly shaken, began to recount her terrible experience, feeling embarrassed to have been found in such a state. She described how she had been kidnapped 2 months ago, just before she was about to leave for an international trip. The kidnappers had held her captive, making outrageous demands to Artur for her release. Even though Artur had done everything he could to ensure her safety, Angelica realized that the kidnappers had no intention of releasing her without gaining more from the situation. This realization motivated her to plan her own escape. Angelica detailed how she managed to outsmart the kidnappers in a single day, refusing to take the medication that left her disoriented. For days, she meticulously studied the place where she was held, observing the kidnappers' movement patterns and waiting for the right moment. The opportunity came when a window was left open during a shift change of the captors. Although she was forced to take the medication again the next day, her resistance had increased, allowing her to escape with little difficulty. After leaving captivity, Angelica found herself lost and confused on the streets. The residual effects of the medication, combined with the scorching sun and persistent hunger, left her disoriented. Every corner seemed a potentially dangerous crossroads, with the constant fear of being recaptured haunting her thoughts. Julio listened attentively as she shared every detail of her rescue journey. From the hospital where he had worked until the day before, Julio could hardly believe the incredible turn of events. He had helped Angelica out of pure empathy, never imagining that she was the mother of the man who ran the entire institution where he had worked. After being rescued and treated by Julio, Angelica was warmly received by her son, Artur. He stepped out of an elegant limousine, and the reunion between mother and son was emotional. Artur, visibly relieved to see her well, kept asking if she was okay and if the kidnappers had harmed her. Angelica assured him she was fine, thanks to Julio's attentive care. The nurse then introduced himself to Artur and explained that he had administered medication to cleanse Angelica's system. He reassured Artur, saying that she would need more time to fully recover, but was on the right path to recovery. Surprised, Artur asked if Julio was a hospital employee. Angelica intervened, explaining that Julio no longer worked there as he had recently lost his job. Artur was dismayed to learn that the man who had helped his mother had been fired. He quickly realized that Julio was not just any nurse, but someone with a huge heart. Upon learning that Julio had been fired for helping his mother, Artur was outraged. He recognized that Julio had seen him at hospital events, but never imagined he was the owner. Artur lamented the situation and apologized for arriving at Julio's house in a limousine, explaining that he was on his way to an important event when he learned of the situation. He made sure to clarify that it wasn't a display of luxury, but a means to get there quickly to help. For Julio, the moment was one of complete surprise. He could hardly believe that the woman who had arrived in such poor condition and under the influence of drugs was actually the mother of the hospital's owner. The turn of events was surreal, but Julio felt a mix of gratitude for having helped someone in need and amazement at the magnitude of the connections that had emerged. As the night went on, Julio, Angelica, and Artur had a lengthy conversation. Artur expressed his deep admiration for the care Julio had shown his mother and promised to reward him for his demonstrated generosity. For Julio, what began as an act of compassion turned into a meeting with destiny, connecting lives in ways he could never have imagined. In the end, they all recognized that the experience was not just about rescuing Angelica, but about how care and empathy can create unexpected bonds and transform lives in profound and meaningful ways. At the hospital where Julio worked, the story began with Angelica, a woman who, by mistake, ended up suffering the effects of a drug that lingered in her body even days after ingestion. Frightened, she sought refuge in a hospital, knowing she could find help from Artur there. Julio, a nurse at the hospital, was about to ask Angelica about Artur when a strange car stopped in front of his modest house. Curious, Julio and Angelica went to see what was happening. To Julio's surprise, a limousine was parked there, and out of it stepped a well-dressed man he was sure he had seen somewhere before. Angelica ran to hug him. It was Artur, her lost son. The reunion was emotional. Artur, worried about his mother's condition after her recent trauma, anxiously asked if she was okay. Angelica, relieved and grateful for Julio's care, assured him that she was recovering thanks to the treatment the nurse had provided to cleanse her body of the harmful substances. When introducing himself to Artur, Julio explained his recent situation at the hospital. He had lost his job but did not regret helping Angelica. Artur, surprised and outraged, revealed to Julio that he was the owner of the hospital where he had recently worked. Julio was shocked to realize that he had helped his own boss's mother without knowing. Artur expressed his dissatisfaction with Julio's dismissal, deeming it unfair. He lamented that someone so dedicated to patient care had been punished for an act of compassion. More than that, Artur was shocked to discover that his own mother had been saved by Julio, without knowing their connection. To make amends, Artur explained that the limousine was not a symbol of ostentation, but a vehicle he was using for an important event. He decided to visit Julio immediately upon learning about his situation, wanting to correct the mistake and show his gratitude for the dedicated care given to his mother. Thus, Julio realized that the woman who had arrived at the hospital desperate and debilitated was actually his boss's mother, and that Artur, besides being a man of great influence, deeply valued the humanism and dedication of his employees. Artur left the hospital determined. He promised to take his mother home and then go to the police, but would return to pick up Julio. He asked the young man to be ready to work. Julio was excited, thinking he would regain his nursing job, which was great for him. Artur safely dropped his mother at home and went to the police. He had not reported the kidnapping as instructed by the kidnappers, fearing they would harm his mother. With Angelica's information, the police began an investigation that led to the gang's arrest later. Keeping his promise, Artur returned to pick up Julio in the limousine, as he still had an important engagement that day. He offered Dona Augusta the opportunity to join them, but Julio's mother preferred not to miss the chance to ride in the limousine. Meanwhile, Barbara saw Julio entering the hospital in his nurse's uniform and rushed to prevent him from leaving, as she had fired him. Upon hearing this, Artur asked if she had fired the nurse. Barbara, who knew Artur through her uncle, proudly confirmed. To her surprise, Artur expressed disappointment with Barbara's decision. As the head of emergency, she should have attended to those in need, regardless of their circumstances. Shocked, Barbara tried to justify her decision, mentioning that Angelica seemed to be under the influence of drugs and could infect the hospital. When Artur finally revealed that Angelica was his mother, Barbara was left speechless. Even so, he did not demand an apology, as his decision to fire her was already made. He stated that refusing care to someone in need was not in line with the role of a head nurse. Artur decided that Julio would be the new chief of nursing at the hospital. He saw in Julio not only the qualities needed for the position, but also the ability to inspire his colleagues. Julio, moved, accepted the responsibility, aware that he was simply fulfilling his duty as a healthcare professional. On the same day, during a ceremony, Julio was formally introduced as the new chief. Meanwhile, Barbara faced difficulties finding another job as a head nurse. With the help of her influential uncle, she ended up accepting a position as a nurse at a smaller hospital. Despite everything, Barbara did not lose her arrogance towards those she considered inferior. Meanwhile, Angelica was recovering from the incident, finally safe and well. Artur left the hospital with determination. First, he took his mother home and promised to return to pick up Julio. He asked the young man to wait for him dressed for work, as Julio expected to get his job back as a nurse. While Artur went to the police, the kidnapping had not been reported. Following the criminal's instructions, and out of fear that his mother would suffer reprisals, Angelica provided information to the police, starting an investigation that led to the arrest of the gang. Later, Artur returned to pick up Julio, as promised, taking him in a limousine due to an important event that day. Artur offered Dona Augusta the chance to join them, but Julio's mother preferred to enjoy the limousine ride. Meanwhile, Barbara saw Julio dressed as a nurse entering the hospital and rushed to confront him, as she had fired him herself. Upon hearing this, Artur asked if it was she who had fired Julio, recognizing her as someone familiar to his uncle. Barbara proudly admitted that it was her, but Artur reprimanded her for denying care to someone in need. Shocked, Barbara tried to justify her actions, mentioning that the woman in question seemed to be under the influence of drugs. Without revealing the patient's identity, Artur let her speak until she revealed that the woman was his own mother. Embarrassed, Barbara tried to apologize, but Artur dismissed her, announcing that she would be fired for her inappropriate conduct. Artur then decided that Julio would be promoted to the position of head nurse of the hospital, not just in the emergency department, recognizing his leadership ability and commitment to the job. Julio, initially surprised, accepted the position with humility, saying he was just fulfilling his duty as a healthcare professional. On the same day, during a ceremony at the hospital, Julio was officially introduced as the new head. Meanwhile, Barbara faced difficulties finding another leadership position in larger hospitals, eventually becoming a nurse in a smaller hospital with the help of her influential uncle. Angelica recovered from the incident, while the story of Artur, Julio, and Barbara showed how integrity and commitment to care can change lives. Imagine a sunny day when Julio, a brave young man, faced a great challenge. He went through a very difficult time when he was kidnapped, an experience that marked his life forever. But Julio did not give up. After this trauma, he found comfort in his friendship with the person who helped him overcome it all, his friend Rebecca. Together, they learned that life can improve when we find true friends. Rebecca was always by Julio's side, supporting him every step of the way. With determination and courage, they faced the world together. Julio soon realized he needed a better job to care for his mother, who had always been his greatest support. With much effort and dedication, he secured a job that changed their lives forever. With the new job, Julio could finally provide his mother with a more comfortable home, close to where he worked. From then on, their lives became calmer and filled with hope. He always remembers with gratitude the day he made an important decision that changed his destiny for the better. Today, Julio shares his inspiring experiences on the channel, Universo Ian Palabras. There, he tells moving stories of overcoming challenges and friendship, like his with Rebecca. Your support is very important to us as it helps us continue telling these stories that can touch everyone's hearts. Watch our videos and get ready to be moved by stories that will make you smile, cry, and believe in the power of friendship. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. A big hug and see you in the next video.